94,000 people inside one stadium, all holding their breath. And for exactly 48 seconds, not one of them made a sound. Not because the power cut out, not because something had gone wrong on the pitch, but because a woman, a Thai girl from Buriram who grew up dreaming in a language that wasn't even her own, had just walked onto the biggest stage in the history of human sport and made it feel like it was designed specifically, exclusively, inevitably for her. The FIFA World Cup 2026 opening ceremony, the most watched entertainment moment of the year. The night that every network, every streaming platform, every football federation and pop culture journalist on the planet had their cameras aimed at the same spot. But here's what the headlines couldn't quite capture. Here's what the broadcast replays almost missed. And here's why, even now, weeks later, people who have never once pressed play on a K-pop track are still talking about what happened that night in Los Angeles. Stay with me. The FIFA World Cup is not just a sporting event. Every 4 years, the planet reminds itself just how true that statement really is. For roughly 30 days, football suspends every other global conversation. Wars, elections, economic crises move to a different room. Because the World Cup speaks a language every country on Earth understands. In 2026, for the first time in history, 3 nations shared the hosting duties: the United States, Canada, and Mexico. 48 teams. A tournament stretching from Vancouver to Guadalajara, from Dallas to New York City. The projected global television audience, spanning every time zone, was the largest ever assigned to a single sporting event. For the opening ceremony, FIFA needed something extraordinary. Something that could speak to Sao Paulo and Stockholm and Seoul and Lagos simultaneously. They got Lisa, Lalisa Manoban, born in Buriram, Thailand, trained in Seoul. Known everywhere else simply as Lisa, 1/4 of Blackpink, now a solo force rewriting the rules of what a global pop star looks like. On the night the World Cup began, the most watched solo performer on the planet. But here is what nobody has properly explained. What exactly did she do that left even the FIFA organizing committee speechless? Why were millions of Western football fans, people who had never opened a K-pop playlist, suddenly pulling up her discography at midnight? And what is the one detail buried in the coverage that mainstream media skimmed straight past? 3 questions, 1 story. Let's go back to where this truly begins. The unlikely invitation. The conversation about who would headline the World Cup 2026 opening ceremony reportedly began more than 2 years before the first ball was kicked. FIFA's mandate was deceptively simple: find a global artist, not a regional star, not a genre-specific act. Someone whose reach was so wide, so verified, and so undeniably cross-cultural that no market on Earth could call the choice exclusionary. That shortlist was long and fiercely debated. North American acts were the obvious first instinct. Latin artists carried enormous weight given the Mexican and South American football fan base. African artists were raised as the ceremony's opportunity to make a historic statement. And then, the data spoke. When analysts mapped quantifiable global reach across streaming platforms, social media engagement, and active fan-base geography across every continent, one name cleared every threshold simultaneously: Lisa. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because the invitation wasn't received the way you might expect. Some voices inside the traditional football ecosystem pushed back. Not publicly, the objections lived in meetings, not press conferences. The argument, reduced to its core: the World Cup opening belongs to an artist from one of the host cultures, or at minimum from football's traditional heartlands. Not a K-pop act. Not someone whose fan base was widely, and wrongly, assumed to skew narrow. Sound familiar? Because we've heard this debate before. In 2010, when Shakira performed the South Africa opening, football traditionalists called it too pop, too commercial. 16 years later, that performance has over 3 billion YouTube views and is remembered as one of the most iconic World Cup moments in history. The criticism evaporated completely. FIFA had a long memory. They made their call. Once confirmed, the production scale was unprecedented. 8 weeks to install the stage at SoFi Stadium. Over 14,000 individual LED units forming a programmable light canvas across the entire bowl. Choreographers flying in from South Korea, the United States, and France. Lisa in rehearsal every day. Sessions running 6 to 8 hours in the final stretch, in a private space built to match the actual stage dimensions. Not because she wasn't ready. She was, but because she understood, more clearly than anyone else involved, what this moment demanded. what it would be measured against for the rest of her career, and possibly the rest of her life. This was the intersection of two worlds that had never collided quite this cleanly before. Organized sport, global pop culture, Western mainstream, Asian artistic ambition. All of it compressed into one evening, one stage, one performance. The doubters were still watching. But nobody, not the skeptics, not the production team, not even the people who believed in her most, was fully prepared for what happened next. The performance that broke the internet. The stadium lights dropped at 7:42 p.m. Pacific Time. 94,000 people inside SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California. An estimated 6 billion people watching through screens across every time zone on Earth. The largest live television audience ever assembled for a sporting event's opening act, according to early broadcast figures. And for 32 full seconds after the lights went out. Total silence. Not the restless silence of an audience waiting for something to happen. The heavy, held-breath silence of an audience that had already sensed, somehow, instinctively, that what was coming was worth paying complete attention to. Then a single spotlight cut through the dark. She didn't sprint onto the stage. She didn't emerge from a trapdoor or descend from wires. She walked, slowly, deliberately, like someone who had all the time in the world and already knew exactly what was about to happen. The opening orchestral arrangement began, a reimagined, sweeping instrumental build that you could feel in your sternum even in the upper tiers. And then, the drop. What followed was 18 minutes that are now being cataloged, without exaggeration, by people who have tracked these things for a living, as the most viewed solo performance in World Cup opening ceremony history. Lisa moved across that stage in a way that is genuinely difficult to translate into words. Which is almost certainly why the clips spread the way they did, because language kept failing people who tried to describe it, and so they kept sharing the footage instead. It wasn't just choreography. It wasn't simply a concert. It was something closer to theater. Athletic, precise, emotionally intelligent theater, staged at a scale that most performers never get access to and wouldn't know what to do with if they did. The performance opened with a medley that blended newer solo material into a production clearly built to breathe in a space this vast. The choreography changed register every 3 to 4 minutes, cycling from high-velocity group sequences with an ensemble of 40 dancers to stripped-back solo moments where the music dropped to near silence and the camera found her face. That contrast, that deliberate contrast between scale and intimacy, that was the architectural intelligence of the whole thing. And then, at roughly the 9-minute mark, came the moment. If you've seen the clip, you know. If you haven't, imagine a performer mid-routine, at full intensity, who makes a single choice so precisely timed and so completely unexpected that 94,000 people respond not with cheering, but with a sound that doesn't have a clean name. Something between a gasp and a roar. The kind of involuntary collective noise that a stadium makes when it doesn't have time to think about what noise to make. Multiple sources close to the production subsequently confirmed it was unscripted. A freestyle moment, a handful of seconds in which Lisa deviated from the rehearsed choreography entirely and did something that lived entirely in the present tense. Her creative director, speaking to press in the days that followed, described it as instinct, as the result of someone who had trained so comprehensively that her body could make correct decisions faster than conscious thought. The stadium did not recover for approximately 45 seconds. The internet didn't wait for the performance to finish. Within 4 minutes of that moment reaching screens, Lisa registered over 1.2 million mentions on X in a single hour, a figure the platform's own analytics team reportedly flagged as anomalous. YouTube's live chat crashed briefly. TikTok clips filmed on phones inside the stadium, shaky, vertical, captured in defiance of the venue's filming policy, began accumulating hundreds of thousands of views before the final note had sounded. The football world's reaction was something no one in entertainment fully anticipated. Professional players warming up in dressing rooms across greater Los Angeles later admitted to stopping everything. Coaches pausing tactical briefings. Players who had never once mentioned K-pop in any professional context, sitting in silence, watching on their phones. Their public posts were notable not for their enthusiasm, but for their specificity. These weren't generic expressions of support. These were people who had just watched something that genuinely surprised them, trying to articulate why. And for a measurable, trackable slice of the global audience, non-K-pop fans became fans in real time. Lisa's streaming numbers on Spotify began climbing before the ceremony had even ended. Not a gradual overnight rise, a spike. The kind analytics teams flag as extraordinary. The conversion rate, first-time listeners becoming active, returning listeners, was significant and documented. One football journalist who had covered 6 consecutive World Cups posted a single sentence: "I have been to every opening ceremony since 2002. I have never seen a stadium react like that." But here is what you need to understand. As extraordinary as that performance was, as definitively as it rewrote what a World Cup opening ceremony could be, the performance itself was only half the story. What nobody told you. Let's talk about what was actually happening beneath the surface of that stage. 2 stories unfolded simultaneously on the night of the opening ceremony. The one 94,000 people witnessed, the lights, the choreography, the sound. And the one playing out in diplomatic offices, entertainment boardrooms, and cultural institutions that sports coverage almost entirely ignored. K-pop as soft power is not a new concept to anyone paying close attention. South Korea's government has understood the export value of its cultural industry for well over a decade. The Korean Wave, Hallyu, is a coordinated, institutionally supported strategy. BTS performing at the United Nations wasn't a spontaneous booking. It was architecture. Lisa's presence at the World Cup opening was not separate from that architecture. It was its most visible expression yet. For the first time in FIFA World Cup history, a Southeast Asian solo artist headlined the opening ceremony. Not as a support act, not as a gesture toward regional inclusion, as the main event. The Thai government's response was immediate and, by the restrained standards of official diplomatic communication, genuinely emotional. Statements went well beyond congratulatory language. Social media activity in Thailand during and after the ceremony registered among the highest per capita engagement of any country in the world that night. Remarkable for a nation whose football team wasn't even in the tournament. Now here is where the media analysis becomes particularly revealing. American press covered the performance almost uniformly through the lens of spectacle. Glowing reviews, but focused almost entirely on visual impact. What they largely skipped, the geopolitical architecture behind the booking, and what it signals about who gets to define mainstream going forward. European press went deeper. British outlets published analytical pieces within 48 hours treating Lisa's selection as a cultural power story, not an entertainment story. French and German commentary framed it around the shifting geography of global influence. Less about K-pop as a genre, more about who draws the map of mainstream culture and who gets to be on it. Then there's the business layer. And the numbers are striking. Within 72 hours of the ceremony, Lisa's streaming figures across all major platforms reportedly reached levels that analysts were comparing, carefully, to the kind of spikes typically seen after Grammy victories. Brand partnership inquiries multiplied at a rate her team described as unlike anything they'd managed in this volume and speed combined. But the ripple went wider than her individual metrics. The K-pop sector as a category on major streaming platforms recorded measurable growth in the days following the ceremony. Analysts tracked statistically significant playlist additions by users with no prior K-pop listening history. New listener profiles entering the genre. The conversion was real and traceable. Football pundits who had never referenced Lisa in any professional context fielded questions about her in pre-match analysis shows. Managers were asked about the ceremony in press conferences. The two worlds, football and K-pop, had technically brushed before, never at this amplitude. And yet, not everyone was celebrating. This is the point in the story where intellectual honesty requires a pivot. In the corners of the internet where football traditionalism runs deep, and those corners are neither small nor inconsequential, a counter-narrative emerged within hours of the ceremony ending. The argument, in its most straightforward form, the opening ceremony had become too much concert, not enough football. That the sport's own cultural identity was being sacrificed on the altar of global entertainment economics. That FIFA had turned the opening act of the world's greatest athletic competition into a spectacle disconnected from the game itself. Some voices went further. And this deserves to be named clearly. The subtext in certain segments of that online discourse carried an undercurrent of discomfort that had very little to do with football at all. The discomfort of watching a Thai woman from Southeast Asia centered on a stage that had historically belonged to Western artists. The discomfort of mainstream being defined by someone who didn't fit a familiar template. Those voices were loud. For about 48 hours. Then the viewership numbers were released. Record. Every single metric. By margins that made the previous record look like a baseline, not a benchmark. The conversation shifted. And then, something happened that even Lisa herself did not fully anticipate. The aftermath and legacy. The morning after the opening ceremony, Lisa posted a single image. No caption. No hashtags. Just a photograph. Her, standing alone on the empty stage after everyone had gone home. Stadium dark around her. One work light still burning. Her shadow long across the polished floor beneath her. It accumulated over 40 million likes within 24 hours. In the 72 hours that followed, every major entertainment and sports publication ran some version of the same headline. The angles varied. The conclusion was consistent. Something had shifted. The slow movement of non-Western artists toward the center of Western mainstream culture had found a moment. Clean. Undeniable. Impossible to argue with. The more careful cultural commentators were quick to frame this correctly. One performance does not dismantle a century of structural advantages. One night does not fix the systemic inequities governing which acts get primary placement, which voices get amplified, which faces appear on the covers in New York and London. Lisa herself, in the weeks that followed, spoke about this with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that distinguished her from performers who might have claimed an easier victory. She called the moment, in one widely cited interview, a door, not a destination. A door that existed now where a wall had stood before. The phrase "the Lisa effect" appeared independently across multiple entertainment industry publications within a week of the ceremony, without coordination. It described a specific and observable phenomenon, the downstream impact of a single performance on an ecosystem of adjacent industries. Fashion houses that had maintained K-pop partnership relationships but kept those acts in secondary placement tiers began accelerating internal conversations about primary campaign visibility. Television networks, particularly in the United States, reportedly fast-tracked development discussions on crossover entertainment formats that had been sitting in conceptual limbo for lack of a clear commercial precedent. Talent agencies in Seoul reported a measurable increase in inquiries from Western entertainment companies. Not just about music, about full-spectrum creative projects, acting, production, brand architecture, and in football, which had never asked to be part of this conversation, something quietly remarkable began to emerge. Several major European clubs, in the weeks following the tournament's opening, reported upticks in merchandise and digital engagement across Southeast and East Asian markets that moved beyond the baseline World Cup surge. Whether those movements connect directly to the ceremony's amplification of regional excitement around the tournament is difficult to establish with clean causality. But the correlation existed. Analysts noted it. And the clubs in question were paying attention. For Lisa personally, the weeks that followed were quieter than the noise around her might suggest. People close to her describe a period of deliberate private processing before the public-facing interviews and the commercial follow-through. She had come off one of the most intense preparation stretches of her career, performed in front of the largest audience any solo pop artist had faced since the modern streaming era began, and then sat with the weight of what that meant. When she did speak, in the interviews, in the long-form profiles, in the carefully chosen public appearances, she returned consistently to a specific image. The girl from Buriram. The child who had crossed a continent to learn music and movement and performance in a language she had to build from the ground up. Who had been told, in ways both explicit and architectural, that the center of the global stage was not built with someone like her in mind. She walked out onto it anyway. And 94,000 people, from 47 different countries, wearing the colors of 38 different national football teams, many of whom had arrived that evening with no idea who she was, went completely still. There will be other opening ceremonies. There will be other artists, other performances, other moments that trend and break records and generate the breathless coverage that this industry runs on. But the question that the FIFA World Cup 2026 opening ceremony placed on the table, loudly, visibly, and in front of 6 billion people, is one that was already overdue. It just needed a stage big enough to make it impossible to look away from. Who gets to stand at the center? And who decided that in the first place? That question does not go back in the box. Here's the thing about defining moments. They don't announce themselves ahead of time. They don't carry signs. They don't pause the narrative and let you know that this, right here, is the point you'll be referencing in 10 years. They just happen. And then, in the weeks and months that follow, you look backward and understand. That was it. That was the line moving. One stage, one spotlight, one woman who had spent her entire career being quietly, structurally, persistently told that the room she was standing in was not quite designed with someone like her at the center. She walked out anyway, and 94,000 people went completely silent. Not because something had gone wrong, but because something had gone so profoundly, undeniably right that the world needed 48 seconds just to absorb it. If this is the first video of ours you found yourself at the end of, welcome. This is what we do here. We cover the stories that live underneath the headlines. The context that the 15-second news cycle doesn't have room for. the architecture behind the moment. Subscribe if that's the kind of content you actually want in your feed. And before you go, there's another story we're sitting on, one that connects directly to everything we discussed today, but takes it somewhere you will genuinely not predict. Keep that curiosity. It's the most useful thing you've got.